The History of Adult Education in America. 1727, Benjamin Franklin establishes what is first called the Leather Apron and then comes to be known as the Junto. It was a discussion club, and it truly was ahead of its time in that it crossed social strata. Franklin went out of his way to get all the gentlemen of the day, the farmer, the merchant, the educator, everyone in town, to come together and share ideas, discuss books they were reading, discuss music that they'd heard, share problems, and try and find solutions through collaborative learning. If you Google this, you can still find copies of the different questions they used to ask. It was great guidelines for, here comes a term from our reading, non-formal, as opposed to informal, non-formal community-based learning. Moving on to 1826, we see the Lyceum. These were public lectures given at the Lyceum, not formal, yet more formalized than the Junto. This was our first step in what became a national movement. People would come together, they would listen to lectures, they would share ideas. This whole movement was credited with anticipating and setting the stage for what would later become a home study type of program, and it introduced the lecture forum as a method of learning. 1873, we see the birth of the Chautauqua movement. It began as a simple training assembly for Sunday school teachers in Chautauqua Lake, New York, and it introduced group discussion and a modified lecture type of system for adult learning. The whole thing spread out, and you would have Chautauquas, where adults would come together, and sometimes they'd be more serious, sometimes they'd be more entertainment-oriented. The movement peaked in 1924, but its legacy continues. There's still Chautauquas out there today, and it truly contributed to the growth of community colleges and the idea of continuing education. Theodore Roosevelt was once quoted as calling the institution the most American thing in America. In 1862, we have two important events. The first is the creation by Abraham Lincoln of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This led to the emergence of the Cooperative Extension System and the Smith-Lever Act, both of which relate directly to adults who are not in school having the opportunity to get learning, whether it's researchers going out in the field to help the farmers or landowners being sought out so that their land could be used for educational purposes and bringing them in as part of the experience. Also in 1862, we have the Land Grant Act, the Morrill Act. This granted land all across the country for the formation of small colleges. How amazing is this if you're an adult living in the middle of nowhere and suddenly there's 2, maybe even 3 colleges that you could suddenly get to. If there's new schools, that means that they have to look for students. Why was this happening in 1862? Well, let's think about it. The Civil War started in 1861. So what's something that the Union, the government of the United States, could do to show that they were in control and everything was okay, and show that there is a purpose in staying true to the Union? Well, you give people something to do that's meaningful. You give them opportunities to be educated. Yes, our government is solid, and they're building, and they're watching our infrastructure, and they're taking care of us and ensuring that we have opportunities for our future. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Every time we look at something really interesting that happens, look at what's going on in the society around it. 1904, New York City. Henry M. Lipziger, and I hope I'm saying that right, and the city's Department of Education promote this free lectures program, and for the first time we see the phrase adult education. They called it an Institute of Adult Education. The great thing about this is it gave a heft, a weight, a solidification to this whole idea of being an adult and going back and learning more. But giving a name to this concept of adult education validated that it was okay. Why New York City? Why this particular year? This was when the subway opened. And all of a sudden, we see people from different social strata mixing and mingling. This was an opportunity to create more of a feeling of an equalized playing field. As well, 1904 was the height of European immigration into New York City, and this was creating social upheaval. Why do people who live in the same city as myself have so much more than I do? Education was seen as a means, and this is so American, of bettering yourself, of being able to provide for your family on a level that your parents never did for you. Thus, promoting free lectures as an institute of adult education truly gave a cohesion to the city and gave people a shared vocabulary and a shared sense of, yeah, I was there, I heard that. 1911, the State Board of Vocational and Adult Education is established in Wisconsin. This is the very first state to establish any formalized system of vocational or technical or adult education. What they required was that every community that had a population of 5,000 or more had to establish an industrial education board. 1918, the first full-time state-appointed supervisors of adult education come to be in New York and in South Carolina. All right, let's look at what's going on in the world again. 1918, the end of World War I. Well, suddenly we have all these adults coming back. They've seen the world. They're looking for jobs. What do? Well, we need to be sure that they're trained to handle the jobs, and we also need to find ways to help integrate them back into society. Thus, we create these new schools, new opportunities for adults to learn what they've missed, to get back into society, to gain skills that have become important while they were away serving our country. 1924, the National Education Association creates the Department of Adult Education. Now initially, again let's think context, this was aimed at literacy, teaching those adult Americans who were actually foreign born to be able to read and write. But they recognized there was such a need that they opened it up to any and all American adults. 1926, we have the Carnegie Corporation organize the American Association for Adult Education. This was the first organization to give some kind of formal structure and a real visibility to adult education on a national level. 1933, we get into the Depression. The federal government establishes the Federal Emergency Relief Act. The main goal initially was to alleviate adult unemployment. Well, how do you do that? First, you have to make sure they have the skills to go out and get these new jobs. So state assistance for unemployed people and their families becomes training. And then you have to get people trained to be the trainers. So what they ended up doing was providing work and education to over 20 million people, as well as developing facilities for this learning to occur. Continuing on, 1935, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, broadened the scope of public school adult education. It stopped it from being this thing that, yeah, private foundations deal with it. The public recognized that this was worth taxpayers' dollars. 1942, we have the establishment of the U.S. Armed Forces Institute. And this is still around. It provided, and does, a variety of educational services to military and civilian personnel in the armed forces, including in correspondence study courses. But they also showed new ways of group study, they created guides, they had residential center programs, they did tests of general education development, which became the GED, to get your equivalent high school diploma, as well as educational and vocational advice. Context check. What was going on in 1942? Why would it be important for the armed services to start supporting greater education for adults in America? Federal funding throughout the 60s and 70s, you can see tons of legislation going on in this time. Well, why? Why was it so important that the federal government decided to jump in? This is not by any means the end of the list. These are just some of the biggest and most well-known. What was going on throughout the 60s and the 70s? Every kind of movement you can think of. The women's movement, Black Power movement, every group was standing up saying, you know, we're not getting respect, we're not being treated fairly. This is the same time where we see all kinds of different rights legislation. So if you've got all these people who feel that they've been treated unfairly and underserved, you have to give them opportunities to catch up. How do you do that? Through education. There is a vast body of information about the history of adult education in America. It's very interesting because, as I mentioned, it never occurs in a vacuum. People don't recognize there's a problem unless they have a reason to. And doesn't that parallel the reading in our book about why adults in general get more education?